Chapter 9, Euclid's Concept Development. 1. Eglident Traditions. A. Antiquity and the Middle Ages. Euclid's elements in 13 books were probably written in the 3rd century before Christ, drawing together materials from a more ancient mathematical traditions, and surely underwent several changes and modifications already during the Hellenistic Age. Several centuries later, the mathematicians town of Alexandria, 4th century AD, prepared an edition of the element, which has had great importance in the following traditions of the text. The oldest extant copies of the elements are, however, Byzantine manuscripts dating back to the beginning of 9th century. Later Greek manuscripts were in circulation among scholars during the Renaissance and in fact provided the Greek text for the first editions of Euclid in the modern world. One further important manuscript was discovered only at the beginning of the 19th century by Francois Ferrat, and it apparently contained a version of the elements older than any other, and possibly predating Thales' editing of Euclid. At least, it seems that its author had access to both Theonine and non-Theonine manuscripts. Or it should be remarked that this statement, endorsed by many scholars, has been challenged by some others. See Nor 1996. Some principles among the 14 or 15 contained in the oldest manuscript, however, came to be considered spurious already in late antiquity. And Proclus, 5th century, the author of a crucially important commentary on the first book in the Element, informs us that a number of them were in fact later interpolations. Modern philology inclines to accept Proclus' opinion and attempts to prove, even if on different grounds, that some of the principles must have been added in the ancient transmissions of the text. The next one is B. Renaissance. In 1533, Simon Grineus published the Edition Princeps of the Greek text. The later editions produced on the basis of the Greek text once again proposed the ancient system of principles, which featured no arithmetical axioms nor any of the further corrections made by Campano. Grineus' editions, however, was based on a Greek manuscript that, probably following Proclus' hint, changed the divisions between postulates and axioms, and only admitted 3 postulates like P1, P2, and P3, or the clearly constructive ones, and listing the others like P4, P5, and P6 among the axioms. Grineus, in fact, even append an edition of Proclus' commentary to Euclid's text, so that the system of principles contained in the Edition Princeps of the Elements was in fact a Neoplatonic philosophical construction. In any case, Grineus' editions of the Greek text remained the only one available for a very long time, and most of the philological editions of Euclid's in Latin or in modern languages, which were prepared in the following 2 centuries, simply followed Grineus' altered system of axioms and postulates. In 1589 editions of his commentary, Clavius added Nasir ad-Din's alleged proof of the parallel postulate, together with a few reflections of his own, and this episode marked the beginning of the rich epoch of the attempts to prove the parallel postulate in Europe. Clavius' complete system of principles, which was to remain a milestone in the following development, contained 4 postulates and 20 axioms in Book 1, and 1 axiom in Book 5, 3 postulates and 12 axioms in Book 7, and in Book 10, there is 1 postulate and 3 axioms. The next one is C. the 17th century. The 17th century was the most creative age in the invention and development of the new principles for geometry and arithmetic, and in many respects the highest point of research into the foundation of mathematics in the early modern age, following an age in which the main goal seemed to be that of the resuscitation of an accurate text of the ancient mathematical work after the corruptions of the Middle Ages. The new century decidedly aimed at the reform and the improvement of the elements beyond what Euclid himself had been able to do. To this effect, several completely new systems of axioms were devised in order to ground elementary mathematics. This innovative line of attack to the ancient texts was especially popular in France and Italy. The next one is the 18th century. In the 18th century, the foundational discussion on mathematics seemed, for the most part, outside the scope of the elements. Most efforts were now dedicated to the many issues raised by new calculus, and reflections on the foundations of mathematics was often aimed rather than justifying the employment of infinite or infinitesimal quantities. These discussions, however, are seldom to be found in an editions of Euclid. Even elementary mathematics is from time to time ground on different principles, and algebra, for instance, offer the possibility of a dissimilar foundational approach, grounded in a symbolic manipulation rather than simple geometrical construction. The elements were no longer regarded as the proper place for advancing a scientific discussion, but rather just as the most classical handbook for a basic schooling in mathematics. The outcome of this modified approach was, on the one hand, a growing attention to pedagogical improvements in the teaching of elementary geometry, and thus a proliferation or simplified editions for students, and on the other hand, a renovated search for a more reliable and philological accurate editions of the element. The next one is 2. Axioms and postulates. A. Ancient principles, group 1 and 2. The Eglident list of the 5 postulates and 5 common notions follow Haber's editions and find its main foundation and justifications in a number of comments made by ancient scholars, who had in their hands editions of the element with lengthier system of principles, but claimed that some of them had been added in the centuries following Euclid. The next one is B. The theory of magnitude, group 3 and 4. These principles were often looked upon as the main axioms of the mathematics universalists, and is to say of a mathematical theory which aspired to encompass both geometry and arithmetic, or in other words, a theory of both continuous and discrete quantities. Many of them were later to be applied in the theory of proportions, which has also been conceived by some authors as a form of universal mathematics. A number of them are especially connected with the arithmetical axioms and may in fact be conflict with them. The reason is that the numbers themselves were often conceived as the collections of unities. This is the Eglident definitions in element 7, and therefore the rules of composition and divisions of number were stated as merological operations. The next one is C. The theory of proportions and the axioms of Archimedes, group 5 and 6. The theory of proportions, to be found in book 5 of the Elements, is probably the part of elementary mathematics which has undergone, in the history of Euclidean corpus, the greatest among the modifications. It was entirely based on a complex system of definitions, possibly conceived by Eudoxus, which suffered serious textual corruptions during the Middle Ages, and which affect all the medieval Latin translations depending on Adelat, including Campano. On the other hand, an entire new theory was developed in the Arabic world from a view hidden in classical thought and the so-called anti-piratic theory of ratios, which, however, as far as I know, was never axiomized and reduced to principles. The next one is the principles of arithmetic, or group 7. As is well known, Euclid's include no principles at all except definitions in the arithmetic books of the elements. The reasons of his treating arithmetic differently from geometry in this way are hard to eviscerate precisely. My guess is that he epistemologically of Euclid's age neither required nor allowed the use of subject-specific axiom in any form. Postulates were allowed in the geometrical books to answer a few sophistical objections and were intended to warrant those auxiliary constructions which were needed in the proofs, but since the arithmetical proofs were considered to have no need of any preparatory cadascue and to be susceptible of being carried out in a purely demonstrative way, that is, through a simple, no postulate were added in Book 7. The next one is Principles on Space and Situations, or Group 8. Many of them come from Francesco Patrici's Della Nuova Geometria and Pascal's Introductions alla Geometria. Now, the importance of these two works consists in their claim that geometry should be regarded as the science of space, a contention which represents a rather new epistemological position in the 16th and 17th centuries, since the day of Eudoxus and Aristotle, throughout antiquity and for a long time afterward. The science of geometry has tended to identify its proper and specific object rather as the notions of magnitude or continuous quantity. As a consequence, spatial notions tend not to be represented in classical mathematical works and are not employed in the elements. These situations persist on into the Middle Ages and indeed even on into the Renaissance and the early modern age. The axioms of Group 2 until 6 bear witness, in fact, to the preeminence of the notions of magnitude over any other general concept. The next one is Principles of Incidence and Continuity, or Group 9 and Group 10. Dimensional considerations are not less central in the axioms of incidence, since these latter deal with the intersections of various geometrical figures. The axioms in this category are among the most interesting of our survey and have survived in more intact form into modern axiomatizations, such as Hilbert's. We may note that Clavius' axioms I5 or two straight lines do not have a common segment, is from time to time also spelled as two straight lines, which coincidence in a segment will coincidence in their entirety if extended far enough, which is, however, an equivalent formulation of the former. Principles of congruence and equality, Group 11 and 12. Axioms of the Group 11 are especially concerned with the rigid motions of features and provide a very partial view on those innumerable debates regarding the use and abuse of movement in geometry, which had already begun in the Arabic Middle Age. The axioms in Group 12 then don't imply construction or displacement, but rather establish abstract criteria for the equality of measure. Clearly, the divide between the two groups is rather artificial and looked at from an abstract point of view. They be considered to state very similar propositions, not less. Their foundational strategies were clearly different in the early modern age. And the next one is the parallel postulate group 13. Now, the last group of principles lists a few alternatives to the parallel postulate, which were conceived to replace the infamous Euclidean principle. It should be noted that the list is far from complete, as many attempts to demonstrate the Eglident postulate were undertaken by making use of different definitions of parallel lines, the most famous of which is that two straight lines are parallel if they are equidistant, or a statement itself equivalent to the postulate if one assumes the existence of this equidistant line. I think that's that I can explain about chapter 9, and please forgive me if I had a mistake in my explanation or in my pronunciation. Thank you for the attention, and I hope I will be better in the next chapter. See you in the next chapter. Bye bye.